Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Gray. I'm going to be reading you the character, the butler, and what the butler saw. The dinner guests started arriving at 7:30. That evening, Reverend Truelove, the neighbors, old Mr. Archibald and his son, and Dame Christie, a lady novelist, were joining the weekend guests. I served the drinks in the parlor before dinner. From the start, I saw things were not going too well. Miss Daphne looked as she had been crying, and after she had spoken a few words to young Mr. Archibald in the hall, that young gentleman looked unhappy too. Mr. Jeffy looked extremely angry. He could look quite violent at times. The actress, Miss Honey, looked furious too, and I could see why. Her companion, Mr. Oscarson, had been flirting with Mrs. Horsehair all weekend as I served the wine at dinner. I noticed they were having a particularly intimate conversation at one end of the table. Dinner ended at 9 o'clock, and I served port, which is wine, to the gentleman in the billiard room. As I left the kitchen, Miss Daphne came up to me, and, looking appealingly at me, she always looks she looks so pretty in blue, pressed a note into my hand, asking me to give it to young Archibald. I could not help reading the note, which said, "Darling, meet me in the conservatory at 9:30. I have a plan. Desperately, Daphne." I served port, remember that's wine, in the billiard room, and passed the note surreptitiously to young Mr. Archibald. Then I went back to the kitchen, where I remained until shortly after 9:30, when I went back into the billiard room to refill the port glasses. As I was crossing the hall, Miss Honey came out of the parlor and went to the ballroom. Oh, lost my spot. Okay, here we go. Sorry. As she opened the door, I heard voices and caught a glimpse of a young man in a white suit. I am sure it was Mr. Oscarson. I went into the billiard room to find only old Mr. Archibald, Reverend Truelove, and Mr. Jeffrey. Mr. Archibald took a glass of port and said he would join the ladies in the parlor, and the Reverend followed him. Mr. Jeffrey took the port decanter, which is like a container, from me and went into the library, saying he had an urgent letter to write. I returned to the kitchen and stayed there until about 10 o'clock when I heard a piercing scream. I rushed into the hall and found Charlotte, the maid, standing there with a tray of coffee cups. She gasped, "Velvet, the library," and fainted. I went into the library and found Mrs. Horsehair dead on the floor. She had been hit in the head. I looked around the room. The port decanter was laying smashed on the floor, and there was broken glass everywhere. The ashtray was full of cigarette stubs, the kind that Mr. Jeffrey smokes. I also noticed immediately that one of the larger silver candlesticks was missing. Both the library window and the connecting door to the billiard room were open. I called for help, and Miss Daphne and her young Mr. Archibald came running from the conservatory. Dame Christie and Myrtle Berry were next on the scene, followed by old Mr. Archibald. Mr. Oscarson came in via the billiard room, following a few seconds later by his actress friend. And last of all, Mr. Jeffrey came rushing in, calling for help and shouting that he had found the vicar unconscious on the terrace. That is what the butler saw.